The night watchman at the mall. I always preferred the night shift. The quiet and stillness brought a peace that the bright, bustling daylight never could. Working as a night guard at a medium-sized mall seemed easy, just rounds and security checks. But there was one store that always filled me with an unexplainable unease. The toy store. It was at the end of a dimly lit corridor, where the light seemed to hesitate to reach. Every time I passed it, I felt something strange, like the toys in the window display were watching me with those glassy eyes reflecting an empty darkness, their frozen smiles almost alive. It was one of those nights, around 3 in the morning, that peculiar hour when everything feels stranger and the silence runs deeper, that I was in the security room, eyes on the cameras, trying to shake off sleep with sips of bitter coffee. Everything seemed normal until I noticed something on the screens. The camera monitoring the toy store corridor showed a light on inside. I was sure I'd turned off all the store lights at the start of my shift, so I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the store. As I walked, the air felt heavier, and the corridor seemed to stretch out, testing my resolve. Finally, I reached the store and saw, through the glass, the lights flickering inside. As I got closer, I heard a faint sound, children's laughter, muffled as though it were coming from far away. Though every instinct told me to turn back, I went inside. The place was bathed in a dim, pulsing light. Among the carefully arranged toys, something caught my eye. A small doll lying on the floor in an odd position, as if someone had dropped it. I approached it carefully and picked it up. It was small, dressed in an old-fashioned lace dress with woolen hair. I placed it back on the shelf, but as I did, I noticed a slight movement at the corner of the store. A small electric train had started moving on one of the display tracks by itself. The sound of its wheels echoed through the empty store, and a faint laugh returned, clearer this time. I took a step back, feeling like the store was closing in on me. When I turned to leave, I heard another sound behind me. The doll had fallen again, but this time it was standing, its face turned directly toward me. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I could feel my breath shorten, my heart racing. Without thinking twice, I left the store, leaving the door ajar and the lights still flickering. Back in the security room, I collapsed into my chair, my heart still pounding. I tried to convince myself that it was all a misunderstanding. But when I checked the cameras again, the lights in the toy store were off, as though nothing had happened. In the days that followed, I avoided the toy store corridor. When I passed it, I kept a safe distance and tried to ignore what I'd seen. However, other guards began to mention strange sounds they'd heard during the night. Laughter, light footsteps, and occasionally, the sound of toys falling to the floor. One night, a new guard, curious and skeptical, decided to investigate himself. He laughed at the stories and walked into the toy store. The next day, he didn't show up for work. We later found out he'd quit abruptly, disappearing without a word. Since then, I've never dared go near that corridor. I avoid the toy store and never mention what I saw. But even with all my precautions on the quietest nights, I swear I still hear the laughter, like the toys are waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to play with them. The night bus driver. Working the night shift on the city's streets didn't scare me. As a bus driver, I'd seen it all. Fights, drunks barely able to climb the steps, even the occasional robbery attempt. But on that cold, rainy winter night, something completely different crossed my path. Something that still lingers in my mind every time I have to drive in the rain. The night felt darker than usual. The rain fell heavily, almost muting the sound of the engine as I followed my route. It was my last trip, and I couldn't wait to reach the terminal and end the shift. The streets were empty, the city a ghost under a blanket of black clouds, and the only companion was the rhythmic beat of raindrops on the windshield. As I turned a corner, I saw a bus stop dimly lit by an old streetlight, and there she was, a woman, standing, soaked from head to toe. She wore a long white dress, like something from another era, her head down, not looking up, as if she were waiting for something or someone. A chill went through me, but I stopped the bus. After all, it was my job. I opened the door and waited for her to board. Without a word, she climbed the steps slowly, her steps heavy and deliberate. She headed straight to the back of the bus and took the last seat without even glancing at me. I tried to ask her destination, but she didn't respond, just stared out the window, though there was nothing to see beyond the rain-blurred world outside. As I drove, I watched her through the rearview mirror. Something about her posture deeply unsettled me. Her face was obscured in shadow, and the fact that she was completely drenched made her look even more out of place. The silence was thick, broken only by the hum of the engine and the relentless patter of rain. When the bus entered a more isolated stretch of road, with no stops, I tried to speak to her again. "Ma'am, are you getting off at any stop?" I asked, but there was no answer. She remained like a statue, frozen in the back of the bus. Each glance in the mirror showed her more removed from reality. Like her presence, there defied logic. Finally, I arrived at the terminal. With my heart pounding, I turned off the engine and turned around to speak to the woman. But the seat where she'd been sitting was empty. She was gone. I looked around, noting the rear door was still shut, and I hadn't heard a single sound of movement. Quickly, I stepped out of my seat and walked to the back of the bus. The seat where she had been sitting was completely dry, without a trace of someone soaked having sat there. With my heart racing and my hands cold with sweat, I stepped out of the bus, scanning the empty terminal. The darkness and incessant rain only heightened the feeling of isolation and silence. I tried to rationalize what had happened, but everything felt surreal. I returned to the bus, locked the doors, and called my supervisor, telling him about the woman who had boarded and vanished. He laughed, saying it was just exhaustion and that I was imagining things. But I knew, deep down, what I had seen was real. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it was a hallucination. Gradually, I started asking other drivers about that area and if they'd experienced anything strange. To my surprise, many of them shared similar stories. A woman in white, always in the early hours, who boarded at distant stops only to vanish before reaching the final destination. Older drivers even mentioned an old legend among the night shift workers. According to them, the woman in white was the spirit of someone who had died in a bus accident years ago in that very area. They believed her soul still wandered, hitching late-night rides and disappearing before reaching the end of the line. I never did find out what happened that night. I try not to talk about it. But every time a heavy rain begins to fall while I'm behind the wheel, that same sense of apprehension returns. Whatever it was, a legend or a ghost, part of me waits, or dreads, seeing the woman in white sitting silently in the back of the bus once more. The nurse of the old hospital. I've always loved my job as a nurse. Over the years, I've worked in many hospitals, but recently, I was transferred to the oldest one in town. The building was immense, worn down by time, and built in the late 19th century, holding only the shadows of its disturbing past. Rumor had it that the place had once been a sanatorium and later, a wartime infirmary. When I heard these stories, I'd smile, try not to let them get to me. But I admit, as I walked through the damp, silent halls, a part of me always felt uneasy. My shift was the night shift, the one nobody else wanted. The stories about the hospital seemed to come to life at night, especially in the oldest wing, where only the patients who couldn't be moved were placed. As the lights flickered at the end of the corridor, I tried to focus on my tasks, but it always felt as if something was there just out of sight watching. One of those nights, I was called to tend to an elderly patient located right in that wing. As I stepped into the damp, dark corridor, a chill ran down my spine. It felt like the place was frozen in time, with the smell of mildew seeping from the walls. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, feeling a quiet presence, though I saw nothing. When I entered the room, the elderly woman stared at me with tired yet piercing eyes. Without any introduction, she asked in a trembling whisper, "Did you see her?" I replied that I didn't know what she was talking about. "The woman in white," she muttered, casting a fearful glance toward the corridor. She's there every night just watching. I did my best to calm the patient, brushing it off as mere shadows. But as I spoke, I heard faint footsteps in the hallway. My voice trailed off, and a strange sense of dread settled over me. I hurriedly checked her vitals and left the room, heart pounding, ears alert for any sounds. I felt as though something was following me. Back at the nurse's station, I found Marta, a seasoned nurse who had worked there for years. After a brief silence, I shared what the patient had said. Marta gave me a serious look and sighed. We've all heard about her. The woman in white. Some say she was a patient. Others say she was a nurse who died alone, waiting for help. Since then, they say she appears in the old wing. Marta's words sent a chill through me. I wasn't a believer in these things, but the memory of those footsteps haunted me. Summoning my courage, I decided to walk to the end of the corridor, hoping to prove it was all just a legend. With each step, the corridor seemed to stretch, and the lights cast eerie shadows on the walls. When I finally reached the end, I turned around, relieved to find nothing there. But then I saw her. At the far end of the corridor, near an old storage room, stood a woman. She wore a long, white dress, her face partially hidden by her hair. Her eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto mine, radiating a profound sadness. I tried to move, but I was frozen in place as if something held me there. The sound of footsteps echoed once more, and this time, I knew they weren't mine. A cold gust of wind swept past, extinguishing the lights momentarily. When they flickered back on, the woman was gone. Heart racing, I sprinted back to the nurse's station. Marta was there, and seeing my state, she simply handed me a cup of coffee, saying calmly, "She always vanishes, but she never truly leaves." After that night, I avoided the old wing. I requested shift changes whenever possible, and when I couldn't, I kept my rounds as far from that part of the hospital as possible. The stories of the woman in white continued, passed on to each new staff member. Most dismissed them as just tales, but those who worked in the old wing knew that on certain nights, the hospital seemed to come alive, and the woman in white was always there, watching, waiting for something no one could quite explain. Now, whenever I work until dawn at around 3 in the morning, I still feel her nearby. Every step I take, it's as though she's right there, invisible but present. And though I rarely speak of it, the memory of her hollow eyes lingers, reminding me that in the old hospital, not all patients have truly left. The gas station attendant on the deserted road. Working as a gas station attendant in the middle of nowhere always had its ups and downs. During the day, the place bustled with truckers and travelers, but once night fell, everything changed. Silence took over, and I was completely alone, just me, the wind, and the occasional sound of an animal in the distance. As accustomed as I was to this atmosphere, there was something about those cold, late nights that made the air feel heavy, as if the solitude was thicker and the isolation deeper. One of those nights, everything seemed quieter than usual. The temperature had dropped sharply, and thick clouds covered the sky, hiding any hint of starlight. I was sitting in a chair in front of the station's convenience store, trying to stay awake by flipping through an old magazine. Time crawled by, and boredom had taken hold of me, until I saw, far off, the faint glimmer of headlights. The car looked old. Its yellowish lights pierced the fog that had begun to form along the road. It approached slowly, and when it finally stopped beside the pump, an inexplicable chill ran down my spine. It was a black vintage car, the kind that seemed to belong to another era. When the driver rolled down his window, I got an even stranger feeling. He was pale, wearing clothes that looked like they were from another time. He didn't say a word, only gestured for me to fill the tank. As the fuel pumped, I noticed that the air around the car felt colder, as though something was draining the warmth from it. When I finished, I walked over to the window to ask for payment. The man handed me an old, worn bill, and as soon as I touched it, I felt a sensation like no other, as if I was holding something that didn't belong in this moment. The paper was freezing, and the texture felt unsettling. When I looked at him, He stared back at me with sunken, empty eyes, like there was no life behind them. Before I could ask anything, he started the engine and disappeared down the road. After he left, I stood there, clutching the bill, my eyes fixed on the empty road. That brief encounter had left me shaken, but I tried to tell myself it was just the solitude of the night. Back inside the convenience store, I examined the bill closely. It was old money, the kind that hadn't circulated in years. My heartbeat quickening, I called a trucker friend who knew the legends of that area. I told him what had happened, describing the car, the driver, and the eerie sensation. He was silent for a moment, then asked, as if he already knew, was it a black, old-fashioned car with a driver who looked out of place? My heart skipped a beat as I confirmed. He then shared a story that chilled me to the bone. He said that years ago, a car just like that one had been involved in a fatal accident near where I worked. The driver had died instantly, and the car was found mangled beyond recognition. Since then, many people had reported seeing it, always in the dead of night at gas stations along the road. It would pull up, get refueled, and the driver never spoke. The strangest part? The bill he handed over always vanished soon afterward. As he finished, I looked down at the bill in my hand, feeling dread growing. It was slowly disintegrating, crumbling into powder, like ashes falling to the ground, as though some unseen energy was consuming it. I dropped the phone, my body shaking and heart racing. Suddenly, everything around me felt darker, heavier. The once familiar silence now felt oppressive. I shut off the station lights and hurried into my car, driving back to town without looking back. But the fear lingered, and as I drove, I felt something following me. Glancing in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw two headlights in the distance, on the same road, as if the black car was following me, always keeping its distance. Every time someone brought up that car, I felt a shiver down my spine. The thought that the driver was still around, that he could appear again at any moment on any given night, became more real than I ever wanted it to be. As time passed, other attendants began to share similar stories. They, too, would hear the sound of a car approaching in the distance, only to find nothing there. The noise of tires on an empty road, headlights far off, and the sudden chill in the air. I knew what they were going through. It was as if that man and his car had never really left that stretch of road, and maybe they never would. Now, every time I pass by that road or take the night shift, I feel like he's there waiting, as if the journey that started all those years ago is still unfinished, and he's always nearby, lurking, looking for someone to share his endless journey. If you love mysteries and the supernatural, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Leave a like to support the work, and share with friends who are into the supernatural. Your engagement keeps these secrets alive.